I didn't do anything fancy with graphics or pictures or anything like that. So you'll have to bear with me and hope that my voice is entertaining enough. But what I'm going to be reviewing and hopefully relatively concisely reviewing is over-the-counter weight loss supplements. Um, and the word supplement we'll kind of get into a little bit. But what I mean is distinctly things that are not prescription medications here. So there's a wide variety of things that we're going to be touching base on. I don't want to go too much into the nitty gritty of this stuff, but we're going to be touching base generally on over-the-counter weight loss supplements. Now, usually when I do a presentation, I like it to be more of a discussion, but as we alluded to already, we're going to be recording this. So any questions, try to either write them down or type them out. I won't be able to see. I think I get a little notification on the screen when there's a hand raised, but I'll try to keep it relatively short. If you guys have questions on anything particular, again, write those down. So just before I dive into stuff, I know I recognize a number of you individuals here who are on the support group. So I think I recognize about half of the folks here that I saw on the call. For those of you who I do not know, you probably have either spoken with or seen one of my colleagues, Ashley Leland or Megan Matson. We are each of us are one of the 3 clinic pharmacists. Our roles within the Ridgeview clinics as large as what we do is medication therapy management, which is sitting down with individuals who have complex medication regimens or multiple chronic diseases and help to essentially optimize the use of their medications. Within the bariatric team and the non-surgical weight loss team, we have a little bit more of a targeted role and a unique role in that we sit down with folks and review their current medications, if they are on medications, and ensure that their medications are not contributing to weight gain or inhibiting weight loss. If they are, we try to formulate a game plan if reasonable to adjust those therapies. And then on the other end of things, the part that you probably don't want to hear me talk about anymore about, because if you've listened to me once, you've listened to me enough, the medications or prescription medications that are used for weight loss. So this is going to be a distinct discussion. It's going to be, like I mentioned, supplements, stuff that you can get primarily over the counter. So brief overview of what I hope to get to today. I want to dive into some of the general categories of mechanisms, or basically how the different common supplements, herbals, over-the-counter type things, how they work, mechanisms, meaning how they actually functionally are either proven to or purported to cause weight loss. And this is where there is similarity between both medications and supplements. Along with that, if we have an established mechanism, we want to make sure that if there is any sort of way to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of these, I want to kind of go into some of how that's done. I don't want to get, again, too much into the boring stuff, stuff that's more interesting probably to me, but probably I gave a little practice presentation to my wife and she was like, that's boring, don't talk about that stuff. So in any case, you can certainly interrupt me if I'm going too much into that. But anyways, I also want to briefly touch on the regulatory components of this stuff as well, because that's important. And then the meat of this presentation will be what I tried to do is compile a list of some of your more commonly advertised or talked about supplements. So these are things that maybe Dr. Oz had mentioned, or things that you've seen on Facebook or marketed to you in magazines or whatever. You know, we've got our targeted ads if you ever Google anything. So these are the type of things that you're going to be seeing. Hopefully I've hit a majority of them there. So just starting off here, when you go and you see something online or wherever you're looking at weight loss supplements, really try to get a sense of what they are trying to sell to you, so to speak, or what the mechanism is here, because it's important that you understand that there's a couple different categories that these exist within. And there's 3 primary ones that you can see on the screen there: appetite suppressants, thermogenic agents, and then also what we would call absorption or digestion inhibitors. And then there's this other category that we'll call just sort of general other. And so appetite suppressants are ones that are, it should be pretty straightforward. These are ones that are going to suppress your appetite or reduce how hungry you are. Now, there's a couple different components to that. There's different elements of appetite that we consider, and it's actually quite a complex discussion in and of itself. But how we affect that from a pharmacological standpoint would be there's cravings, there's certain medications that can do that, there's certain supplements that can do that. There's agents that help with the formation of satiety, so how full you feel when you're eating. That has to oftentimes do with gastric motility, or the way that your stomach and your intestines move food. And then there is more what I would categorize as a general appetite suppression effect, something like what we think about with a very common medication called phentermine is one that we use oftentimes in that category. We'll get to the supplements here in a minute. The thermogenic agents are ones that are this almost what I would sort of describe as this unicorn type of effect, that we're looking for something that we can just take and will burn more calories. Now, in the real world, there's nothing that necessarily does that to this really robust or significant effect where we can just hand someone this supplement and say, oh, now you're going to burn an extra 500 calories a day. Unfortunately, there's nothing quite that exists like that, but there are agents that will either inhibit or slow down the process by which fat cells are formed, or it will affect certain components of your metabolic processes, and that's what are generally categorized as thermogenic agents. And then the absorption and digestion inhibitors are pretty straightforward. Basically, we're trying to inhibit the absorption of either carbohydrates or lipids. We don't oftentimes try to inhibit the absorption of proteins. There's a number of reasons for that, and there's a number of I guess general issues that we have with the medications, but also supplements that inhibit the absorption of and digestion of certain macronutrients. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit here as we go through the list. And then there's this other category. There's supplements specifically that have components of each one of these that have been associated with it. So I'll try to call that out as we go through here. Okay. I'll try to be real brief with this slide, but there is one important call out that I will have here. The distinction between a prescription medication and a supplement really falls into this. A prescription medication is something that is, well, they're both regulated by the FDA, but a prescription is something that requires pre-approval before it's allowed to be sold on the market, and it also requires a prescription to be purchased, basically. Typically, that means it has to come through a pharmacy or a medical supplier or a clinic or something like that. And that requires rigorous, interchange the word vigorous and rigorous, but study, meaning that we have to have animal trials and then phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials for these drugs. Now, supplements are regulated by the FDA, or supplement manufacturers are regulated by the FDA, but they don't have to have any sort of pre-market approval. All they do is they get to sell their product. But the trade-off to that is that they do not get to claim that their product does anything to diagnose, and this second bullet point under the supplement manufacturer's point is straight from the FDA and straight from the regulatory vernacular. It says you cannot claim that their products diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. All that you can really claim is that there is supportive function there, that the supplement, like for example, vitamin D does not cure calcium deficiency, but what it does, well, and actually that's a bad example because you can argue that it does. But in any case, so there's supplements out there that you cannot make that argument for. So, and you have to have evidence and pre-approval to do all that. So within those types of statements, there are, despite there not being a need to have that pre-approval, many supplement manufacturers will have, or universities will, or individual research groups will look at the efficacy and safety of these products in usually small clinical trials. And when we say efficacy, what we're looking at is, does this supplement work? And safety is pretty straightforward. Is it safe for us to use? And you'll see the comment that I have there under each of those is that there is quite a bit of variable data. And we'll get into this again with some of the meat of this presentation, so to speak. But what I mean by that is, because there's not a need for this data to be essentially present at the time of the product release, it's all retrospective and oftentimes market driven. So we've got really small trials of 50 to 150 people, and oftentimes that's not quite enough for us to really draw any conclusive results out of. So anyways, we'll get into that. And again, as you're accumulating questions, please type those in there as we go through here. This is usually when I would say, are there any questions? I'm usually talking too fast. So anyways, so as we move along here, this is the list I was referring to of really common, and frankly, if you want to try and find a common list of these things, you can just Google weight loss supplements. Googling things is always a Pandora's box of good, bad, but mostly random pieces of information. directed at now that Google has learning capability. It'll learn what sort of things it's going to target at you based off of advertisements, yada yada, so on and so forth. But what we've got here is a good chunk of supplements that have been around, and you'll see some herbals here. You'll see some things that are categorized more as just yeah, you can't quite call it a vitamin, but it is a manufactured compound. These are things that have been around for the last 5, 10. Some of them have been around for hundreds of years, but we're using them and manufacturing them and isolating them now. We're going to go through each one of these, and hopefully not in a sense that would be considered ad nauseum, but we're going to go through some of these here and kind of give you pros, cons, and available evidence on each one of them. And hopefully everyone recognizes at least one of these things here. And if you're someone who likes barbecue, hopefully you recommend apple cider or recognize apple cider vinegar there. That's on my mind because my wife just got me a smoker for my birthday, which I'm very excited about. Okay. So starting off with raspberry ketone, I like to pick this one first because it's one that oftentimes comes up, especially if you do like a Google search here. Raspberry ketone is a supplement that has actually been recommended by a guy named Dr. Oz. I'm sure many of you have come across Dr. Oz. I'll just go ahead and say it. I'm not the biggest fan of his recommendations myself. A lot of his recommendations come from not a great evidence base, but that's not the purpose of me bringing this up because this one is actually an interesting compound here. So raspberry ketone is another. I keep on bringing my wife into this presentation. I should have her sitting next to me, but I asked her, could you identify a smell with a red raspberry? And I thought to myself, I don't really think I can, but if you could identify a smell with a red raspberry, it would be attributable to the raspberry ketone present within. And this is the compound that has been purported to affect, and I broke this down or simplified this by a number of steps, but it affects fat metabolism, long story short. And this is when we say the term in vitro, meaning that we look at the way that fat cells are formed in a lab sense, not in a person, and that's how raspberry ketones can affect fat metabolism. Now, and what that does is supplemented in a certain dose in a certain way, has been purported to cause weight loss. There's only one randomized clinical trial with raspberry ketone. It has that N equals 70, means there were 70 people in the trial. That's not a lot to begin with. We had 25 people drop out of this trial, and the data was only reported on a total of 45 participants. And the tricky thing with this trial was that it was studied in a proprietary blend, which means that whoever made this supplement had raspberry ketone and then a number of other herbals. So the effect that we were able to draw out of it, or that the researchers were able to draw out of the study, wasn't necessarily something we could solely attribute to the raspberry ketone. That being said, over 8 weeks, folks that were in this trial, the 45 that there was data reported on, saw about a 2 kilogram weight loss versus about a half a kilogram weight loss with placebo. So what that would mean is somewhere between 4 to 5 pounds with the supplement, and about somewhere in the 2 pound range with the, or 1 to 2 pound range with the placebo. So not a whole lot to take away from it. It's an interesting mechanism. The cool thing, I guess, if I had to describe it with raspberry ketone at this point, there is no safety concerns. Oftentimes, or at least apparent safety concerns, have been reported to the FDA. The FDA is doing a pretty good job about what we call surveilling for these things, or watching for any sort of reports out of hospital systems for folks who are presenting with any sort of kidney, liver damage, things along those lines. So in any case, raspberry ketone. I intend to not go that long on any particular one of the subsequent supplements I'm going to talk about here, but that was the one that I think gathered a good chunk of media attention recently. So moving on, this is one that I have struggled to pronounce. It's called Garcinia, I believe is how we pronounce it. It's got its full chemical name, Garcinia cambogia, I believe is what it's called. This is specifically an herbal that contains a compound called hydroxycitric acid. With this, its mechanism is, and I'm going to have to bring up my notes here because this is one that has a number of, oops, I'm going to go back here, a number of purported components to its mechanism. But this is another one that theoretically will interfere with or influence the way that fat cells and adipose tissue is really processed and formed. And it's driven through, again, that hydroxycitric acid. This is one that there has been a number of safety concerns with, being that there have been renal and hepatic failure and damage. Basically, that would be kidney and liver damage associated with this. That being said, it is one that also has a little bit more clinical study on it as far as its effects. Um, You'll see when you look at these, a lot of these studies have 60 patients or 135 patients, or on the previous one, it was like 70 patients. What we really need for a really strong recommendation to use or not use some of these supplements is we really need to assess a good weight loss effect, probably somewhere closer to 400 or 500 people in a good randomized trial. So that's where it's a little bit hard to pull away some of this stuff. But in any case, so hydroxycitric acid specifically studied, sourced from Garcinia. There was a couple studies. We see one with the 60 patient study that had about a 5 to 6% BMI reduction, which is certainly nothing to scoff at. That being said, this other one that you see here, 135 patients actually saw a higher raw number of weight loss in placebo compared to the active treatment group. So this is something that would probably have been fleshed out if we had a few more people in the study. But that being said, not a whole lot convincing if you see Garcinia in a supplement online that you're looking at using. Probably not anything worth considering, at least at this time. Okay, moving along here. I'm sure, if not most of you, if not every single one of you, had heard of ephedra. This is a supplement that was around for quite some time, an herbal. It was actually removed from the market by the FDA here in the United States in 2004, and then just prior to that from Canada in 2002. This is one of your more classic appetite suppressants. Ephedra is what we would call similar to a sympathomimetic, so it activates your sympathetic nervous system. That part of your nervous system is responsible for what we would call the fight or flight response, and what that does is essentially turns down the volume on your rest and digest centers, and that's where it causes an appetite suppressing effect. And it was removed, ephedra specifically was removed from the market because of cardiovascular concerns primarily throughout the 90s and prior to that really, but especially in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, after the FDA made that action, a lot of supplement manufacturers put a replacement called bitter orange as a replacement for ephedra. Now, the reason why they did that is this compound called synephrine, which if you read it and look at it, it kind of sounds like pseudoephedrine and maybe epinephrine, and that's because it has a similar chemical structure to those things. And that synephrine is what from bitter orange is similar to ephedra, and where we have seen some similar pharmacological actions, if you will. So that being said, it's hard to really get a good line on whether or not bitter orange is effective because of the fact that depending on where you're getting your bitter orange, what the supplement manufacturer is using, there is a wide variety of percentage of synephrine inside the bitter orange component, and there's a wide variety of variability as far as what we're actually getting with the synephrine content, and in doing so we get a spattering of positive and negative clinical data, meaning that we don't have a great clear picture as to whether or not this is worth using from a efficacy standpoint. From a safety standpoint, we know that there have been, again, vascular concerns, as you can see there, with synephrine. So especially anyone who has any background of high blood pressure, arrhythmias, or certainly any background of heart attack or stroke, we typically recommend against the use of these type of products, and generally to stay away from them if we have any sort of other general chronic health concerns. At this point, we're going to start combining some of these slides and going over just a brief statement on a couple of these things, just to make sure I'm not going too long-winded here. That being said, so apple cider vinegar, I know this is one that I have encountered a number of times over the course of the past, especially like last 2 years. And I know I jokingly alluded to it as an ingredient in things like barbecue sauce. It is and has been purported to be useful for a lot of different things. I've seen it's used as like a cleanse. It's used, some folks are using it as a agent to treat heartburn and gastric esophageal reflux disorder, a lot of things along those lines. I wouldn't use apple cider vinegar. Vinegar specifically is acetic acid, not too typically very helpful in reducing acid secretion. But what it has also been associated with is helping to control blood sugars and diabetes, things along those lines. So the court is still out on a lot of these things, or the jury, I should say. But it has been associated with weight loss. Now, there is one published clinical trial on apple cider vinegar for weight loss. As you can see, another small trial here, 39 patients. This is one that I unfortunately did not get the access to as far as being able to look at the specific clinical data, but they did report in their abstract positive effects on BMI, lipids, which would be your cholesterol, in comparison to the placebo group. There is not a mechanism that's tied to apple cider vinegar, so we'll have to see what comes out with that, but certainly something that would be considered a little bit of a, I guess we could call it a safer thing to try. There's certainly nothing that we're aware of that would be causing significant safety concerns at this point with that. So moving on to this next one, and this would be another one that I would love to, and hopefully once we open up the discussion and end the recording here, I'm not actually quite sure how to pronounce this one either. Hujia is how I'll pronounce it, or Hujia, is an interesting one because this is one that has been around for hundreds of years. Any of your herbals have been around, whether or not we've been using it is a question. So the interesting component to this is it is a appetite suppressant. I threw this little interesting factoid in. It's from Southern Africa. Indigenous folks down there would use it on long hunts to suppress their hunger while they're whatever they happen to be hunting. I forget the indigenous folk that are attributed to having used this. I'd have to double check on that. But in any case, so this has a couple clinical trials behind it. It is present in a lot of different proprietary blends with a lot of different supplements that you'll see online specifically. There is some initial weight loss that's seen in some of the clinical trials that have been done with this. Again, smaller clinical trials, but that isn't really something that's seen as sustainable, meaning that as we follow the data further along, that those effects seem to diminish. Again, with a lot of your appetite suppressants, there is theoretical cardiovascular concerns, just due to the potential for that to activate that sympathetic nervous system. That's how this one is no different. It is a stimulating effect, and that can carry through, though there is not any direct case reports that I'm familiar with this particular supplement causing issues. Okay, only a couple more slides here. I'll just check here. Yeah, we got 3 more I want to quickly touch on. Some interesting things here. Pyruvate, if any of you remember taking your high school chemistry or biology class, if you remember your carbohydrate metabolism, pyruvate is one of the steps in that. And I probably lost all of you talking about high school biology, but pyruvate is basically I believe it's a 3-carbon chain, whatever, it doesn't matter. This has been studied as a weight loss supplement. It is something that has been sort of indicated to enhance metabolism. There are a number of clinical trials that have actually been summarized in what we would call a meta-analysis, basically pooling all the data so we can get a little bit stronger understanding of what's going on here. And it has been demonstrated that to be marginally beneficial. Essentially what it's used as is a replacement of what your carbohydrates would be. Now, the issue with this is pyruvate needs to be administered in a large quantity, so usually something like 3 to 6 grams, like 3 times a day. And depending on the supplement that you go and buy, that would require you to take like 30 to 60 capsules a day, which is very, we'll just say, prohibitive as far as what most people are wanting to or willing to do. And it's also pretty expensive to do. So that's sort of the limiting factor on pyruvate. But it is, because of some of that data, oftentimes included in a number of different, again, proprietary blends of these different weight loss supplements. As far as side effects, if you're using at those very high doses, you'll see gas, bloating, a variety of GI side effects. Otherwise, not necessarily unsafe to use, because it is something that, again, it's hard to achieve those levels that you're really going to see much of an effect out of. Okay. This is another one. It sounds like I sound probably like a broken record here. This is another supplement that I have a hard time pronouncing the name of. So we'll just call it by its common name, African mango. I alluded to a category of weight loss meds and haven't touched on any of these that are considered to be either digestion or absorption inhibitors. This is one that would be considered a digestion or an absorption inhibitor. You'll see that second point there. It also notes that there has been some data indicating that it can, again, inhibit the formation of adipose or lipid tissues. But really, its primary mechanism is that it is considered sort of a bulk-forming laxative. So it inhibits the rate as well as the amount of time that your body has to absorb specifically carbohydrates. This one is, again, one that if you're sort of reading through a weight loss supplement, you'll see a number of these herbals that are included. This is one that is very frequently included in those herbals or I should say in those proprietary blends. Not a whole lot of positive data indicating clinical benefit, and not a whole lot of safety data for us to look at and say, well, this is good or bad. So this is one that you'll see very frequently, just not a whole lot of published clinical data there. So the last one I want to mention here is conjugated linoleic acid. This is one that's actually a little bit interesting. It's been studied a little bit more recently here. This is actually something that's very present in our dairy and beef products. It's a type of essentially a type of fat that you will find in dairy and beef. And the interesting thing with this is, again, you're going to see that term increased fat breakdown, and you'll see it over and over. And for obvious reasons, it's a target that we're looking at. Now, the interesting thing with this is that we're using essentially sort of, I don't want to compare it directly to something like my brain is like a flaxseed oil or something like that. Probably closer to something that we would consider like an alpha lipoic acid as far as how your body would tolerate it. But what we see with this is that it is maybe marginally beneficial, and you can see that small trial there again, right around 63 people. About 0.7 kilograms of weight loss versus 0.5 kilograms with placebo. So the thing with this one is that in those small trials, they were actually looking at a number of different things. The potential drawback of this one, aside from the day-to-day adverse effects with it, would be its potential to increase LDL cholesterol, which would be your basically the cholesterol that we don't want to increase, the bad cholesterol. So that's that one. And again, you will see this, and the reason I included this is you will see this if you're looking at weight loss supplements, whether it be at GNC, you're looking online at a number of the different independent supplement companies. Don't be surprised if you see this one advertised. Long story short with it, not a whole lot of clinical evidence to support its use. So as we went through that, it was a lot of me talking through clinical trials, what evidence we have, and basically, the summary that I would provide after our discussion here is there is a lot of stuff out there. I probably scratched the surface with the number of supplements that I talked about. Again, I tried to find the most commonly used ones. The biggest thing when you're looking at these is that if you're going to touch your toes in the water and try one of these things, be very careful that you're not introducing it in the context of a number of other prescription medications that these could theoretically interact with, and especially cognizant of your own medical background. Especially the biggest disclaimer that I would use is that if you have any background of cardiovascular disease, a lot of these cardiovascular disease, arrhythmias, high blood pressure, a lot of these supplements have the theoretical or in some cases demonstrated potential to cause risk for worsening or causing a extra event, meaning something like a heart attack or a stroke. No, I don't think that these supplements that you're going to take and immediately have one of those, but it's a risk factor we have to be cognizant of. So it's very important that if you're going to introduce them, introduce it in a measured way. I have sat down with individuals who have had, I think the most I remember counting was 45 different supplements, meaning 45 different blends of different things, and sat down and asked the question, well, what's this one for? Well, I'm not really quite sure. That's the biggest thing. Make sure that you're aware of what you're using it for, and try to measure the pros and cons that you get out of it. These can be very costly. I alluded to a couple different products that require you to take a bunch of these on a daily basis. So just be very cognizant of the cost of these and the potential for maybe marginal benefit. So that being said, I have a reference slide that I don't have attached here, so I'll have to get that. Each of those clinical trials, I have a reference in case you guys want to go read that stuff. It's not the most exciting reading, I'll tell you that. But what